A federal judge sitting in open court looks at the leadership of one of America's oldest airlines and says, on the record, that nothing he has heard gives him confidence that this company has the money or the people to survive. Not a rumor, not a hallway whisper. A judge publicly questioning whether an entire airline deserves to continue existing. The airline is carrying billions in debt. Its employees have taken pay cuts, watched their pensions get frozen, and seen colleagues laid off by the thousands. And yet, those same employees are fighting to keep this airline alive. Not because anyone ordered them to, but because they believe it can become something better than what it is. That airline did not get liquidated. It did not get absorbed. It went on to become, by almost every measurable standard, the best-run airline in the United States. And right now, today, while a war in the Middle East is sending jet fuel prices up nearly 90%, while every competitor is scrambling to cut costs and raise fares, this airline just posted record first quarter revenue, is sitting on a mind-blowing $8.1 billion in liquidity, and owns an oil refinery that the entire industry laughed at when it was purchased. It is also the only American carrier flying the Airbus A350-1000, the largest and most capable wide-body Airbus has ever built. This is the story of Delta Airlines. And the reason it matters is not just what Delta did, but how every decision it made exposes the difference between running a business for the next quarter and building one that actually survives when the world falls apart. Delta's bankruptcy was not some brief financial hiccup. The airline had been bleeding for years. A collapsing travel market, relentless pressure from low-cost carriers, and fuel costs that refused to stop climbing had pushed the company past the point of no return. The debt load was catastrophic. The cost structure was unsustainable, and the people at the top had not convinced anyone that they had a path forward. Ed Bastian was Delta's financial controller during that period. He had watched the airline drift for so long that he quit. He walked away, took a position at a smaller firm in Atlanta, and told himself he was done. Months later, when new leadership came in to manage the restructuring, they called him back. He returned, and from that point forward, he never left, moving from chief financial officer through the bankruptcy to president during the recovery to chief executive. The man who walked out of Delta at its darkest moment ended up deciding what the airline would become. The bankruptcy lasted 19 months. Delta cut $3 billion in annual costs, reduced its net debt from roughly $17 billion to about $7.6 billion, froze pilot pensions, sold off its Atlantic Southeast Airlines regional subsidiary, and retired over 130 older aircraft. It also survived a hostile takeover bid from US Airways that would have ended Delta as an independent company. That last detail is worth sitting with. Employees who had just absorbed pension freezes and pay cuts organized a grassroots campaign called Keep Delta, My Delta. Thousands signed a petition opposing the bid, not because management asked them to, because they did not want to be absorbed by an airline they did not trust. That kind of loyalty from people who had every reason to be cynical is not something you manufacture. It comes from decades of relationship building between a company and its workforce. And it tells you something about what was already there even before the recovery began. Out of bankruptcy, Delta immediately made the move that would define the next 2 decades. They merged with Northwest Airlines in an all-stock deal, creating at that moment the largest airline in the world by passengers carried. Now, airline mergers almost never go well. The United and Continental combination produced years of operational chaos. The American and US Airways merger created customer service problems that American is visibly still dealing with. The standard assumption in the industry is that combining 2 large network carriers is nearly impossible to execute cleanly because the labor conflicts alone, especially around pilot seniority lists, can paralyze operations for years. Delta and Northwest were different. Instead of declaring one culture the winner and forcing it onto the other, Delta kept what was better from each side. Northwest Pacific Network and its Tokyo hub were superior to anything Delta had built alone. Rather than dismantling them, Delta preserved and expanded them. The pilot seniority agreement was not universally popular, but it was accepted. That single fact cleared the path for an integration that reached full operational unity faster than any comparable merger in American aviation history. With the merger complete, the real question became what kind of airline Delta actually wanted to be. The conventional answer at the time pointed toward low fares and price competition. Spirit and Frontier were expanding aggressively on the premise that passengers would always choose the cheapest ticket. Even the legacy carriers were investing in stripped-back, basic economy products designed to compete at the bottom. Delta went the opposite direction. The insight Bastian has articulated repeatedly is straightforward. The American aviation market contains two fundamentally different passenger populations. One is price sensitive. The other, business travelers, frequent flyers, premium leisure passengers, people who travel enough to know the difference between a good experience and a bad one, is quality sensitive. Delta concluded that the second population was larger, more commercially valuable, and more underserved than the industry had acknowledged. So they built an airline optimized for that population, at the explicit cost of not competing for the first. That decision cascaded into everything. Delta invested in on-time performance, not just operationally, but in how it scheduled flights, what buffer it built into timetables, and how it managed disruption recovery. Delta has now been named North America's most on-time airline by Cirium for 5 consecutive years. Every major completion and punctuality metric for an entire year across a network of that scale. Delta rebuilt airports. The LaGuardia transformation is the most visible example. What was historically one of the worst airport experiences in the United States became a facility passengers actually want to be in. The Sky Club lounge network was expanded and upgraded across the system. These are infrastructure investments with long payback periods that only make sense if you are committed to the strategy for decades. Delta restructured its premium cabin economics from the ground up. Coming out of bankruptcy, only 15% of first-class seats were being sold at full price. The rest were complimentary upgrades or heavy discounts. The product existed, but the revenue did not. Bastian introduced a tiered system, Comfort Plus, First Class, and Delta One, each positioned to expand premium travel to a wider range of passengers while maintaining pricing discipline at the top. And in April 2026, Delta unveiled its next generation Delta One suite for the Airbus A350-1000. 24-inch 4K screens, Bluetooth connectivity, wireless charging, and longer sleeping surfaces. This aircraft, with roughly 15% more premium seating than what it replaces, will be the largest and most premium configured plane in Delta's fleet. And Delta is the first and only American carrier to have ordered it, 20 with options for 20 more. Now let's rewind back in time. We're going to April 32, 2012, when Delta did something that shocked the aviation and oil industries at the same time. It bought an oil refinery. The Trainer Refinery, located on the Delaware River, about 10 miles southwest of Philadelphia. $150 million to acquire, plus another $100 million to convert infrastructure for maximum jet fuel output. Analysts were almost universally negative. The logic, though, was sharper than the reaction suggested. Jet fuel typically represents between 20 and 35% of an airline's operating cost. The spread between crude oil and refined jet fuel, the crack spread, had been widening for years. Refiners were capturing more margin, and airlines were absorbing it as a direct cost increase. Financial hedging can reduce crude oil exposure, but it cannot hedge the crack spread. Delta concluded that owning refining capacity could address the problem that financial contracts could not. The refinery processes 185,000 barrels of crude oil per day and produces roughly 52,000 barrels of jet fuel daily. It does not protect Delta from rising crude prices. When crude spikes, Delta pays more, along with everyone else, but it protects against the crack spread. And right now, that distinction matters more than it ever has. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran, and the cost of jet fuel changed overnight. According to Airlines for America, jet fuel prices in major American cities surged nearly 88% between late February and early April. Every airline on Earth started running the numbers on how long they could absorb costs at that level before the damage became permanent rather than temporary. Delta just reported its first quarter results on April 8, 2026, and the numbers tell a story that cuts both ways. Adjusted operating revenue hit $14.2 billion, a record for a first quarter and up 9.4% year over year. Premium ticket revenue grew 14%. Loyalty and partner revenue climbed 13%. The American Express partnership alone generated over $2 billion in a single quarter. Corporate sales hit a first quarter record. MRO revenue more than doubled to $380 million as other airlines increasingly send their aircraft to Delta's Tech Ops division. Adjusted pre-tax income came in at $532 million, up 42% from last year. But, as always, there is the flip side of it all. On a GAAP basis, Delta posted a net loss of $289 million, driven by a $550 million investment loss and surging fuel costs that reached $2.6 billion for the quarter. For the second quarter, Delta expects its fuel bill to be roughly $2 billion higher than last year, based on a price of around $4.30 per gallon. The refinery is expected to contribute about $300 million in savings. Meaningful, but not unlimited. Delta is cutting capacity by 3.5%, raising checked bag fees for the first time in 2 years from $35 to $45 for the first bag, and reducing domestic frequencies to protect margins. Stepping back to the bigger picture, the American Express relationship is arguably Delta's most important competitive asset in this environment. SkyMiles has over 120 million members. In 2025, the partnership generated $8.2 billion, up 11% year over year, with over 1 million new card acquisitions. That spending reportedly approaches 1% of the entire United States gross domestic product. Delta has publicly stated its long-term goal is to push that figure to $10 billion. This revenue requires no aircraft. It burns no fuel. It employs no flight crew. In a world where fuel costs have nearly doubled and every operational expense is climbing, a revenue stream disconnected from fuel consumption is protection that no financial instrument can replicate. But Delta has optimized SkyMiles aggressively for revenue generation rather than for traveler satisfaction. Award redemptions have become more expensive. Lounge access has been restricted. Longtime loyal members feel the value has eroded, and those complaints are not unfounded. Whether that trade-off has lasting consequences is one of the open questions about Delta's future. The profit-sharing program is another piece worth examining. In February 2026, Delta distributed $1.3 billion to roughly 100,000 employees, more than the rest of the American airline industry combined. Since 2015, total payouts have exceeded $11 billion. The formula gives employees 10% of the first $2.5 billion in adjusted profits and 20% above that. It is not charity. It is alignment. When the people delivering the brand promise share directly in the financial result of delivering it well, the incentive structure of the entire organization shifts. Delta was recently ranked in the top 10 of the Fortune 100 Best Companies to Work For list, a recognition that almost never goes to airlines. And then there is the sustainability question, which landed actually not so long ago. Delta quietly removed its pledge to use sustainable aviation fuel for 10% of its jet fuel by 2030, and changed its net zero emissions target from a goal to what it now calls an aspiration. This happened days after its chief sustainability officer publicly celebrated the airline's environmental progress. It is a meaningful retreat. You can argue it is honest, that nobody in the industry is on track to meet these targets, and Delta is simply being transparent about it. You can also argue that it undermines credibility at a moment when the industry's broader climate commitments are already under pressure. Either way, it is worth noting because it shows that even the most disciplined operator in American aviation is making trade-offs that complicate the narrative. Full year 2025, Delta's centennial year, delivered $63.4 billion in operating revenue, $5.8 billion in operating income, and earnings per share of $7.66. Free cash flow hit $4.6 billion, the highest in company history. Return on invested capital was 12%, placing Delta in the upper half of the S&P 500 across all industries, not just airlines. Premium and loyalty revenue streams now represent 60% of total revenue. Looking forward, Delta has placed orders for 95 new aircraft in the first quarter alone. 34 Airbus A321neos, 16 Airbus A330neos, and 15 Airbus A350-900s. 60 Boeing 787-10s. And not to forget, the 20 Airbus A350-1000s already on order. With deliveries beginning next year, these are long lead time investments designed to replace aging Boeing 767s and 757s while deepening Delta's premium cabin advantage for the next decade. What the last 2 months have exposed in real time is something that cannot be absorbed from a case study. The decisions that looked strange, expensive, or counterintuitive in calm times are precisely the ones that determine who absorbs a shock and who gets crushed by it. Buying a refinery when the industry called it irrational, building a loyalty program that generates $8 billion from credit card spending, investing in premium cabins when conventional wisdom said price was everything, paying employees over $1 billion a year in profit sharing when competitors were cutting costs in bankruptcy court, walking away from hard climate targets when the math stops working. None of those decisions fit neatly into a single narrative of excellence. Some of them are brilliant, some of them are uncomfortable. All of them together are the reason Delta sits where it does today, navigating a crisis that is testing every airline on Earth while holding a hand that nobody else was willing to build. But the question nobody can answer yet is this. Delta is guiding to $1 billion in profit for the second quarter on a $2 billion increase in fuel costs. That is impressive, but it is also a margin that leaves very little room for surprises. If this conflict drags on, if fuel stays elevated through the back half of the year, even the most resilient airline in America will face choices that test the strategy to its limits. So what I want to know from you is this. Do you think Delta's model is truly built for a prolonged crisis, or is there a breaking point that even the best-run airline eventually reaches when the world refuses to cooperate? Let me know in the comments. And if this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, hit like and subscribe so you are here for whatever comes next. That was it for now. Thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you again in my next video.